The morning mist clung to the red clay hills surrounding Sanh combat base. Like a shroud of foreboding, Marine Lance Corporal Tommy Rodriguez squinted through the haze as he walked his perimeter guard duty, unaware that January 21st, 1968 would mark the beginning of 7 to 7 days that would test every fiber of his being. The silence was deceptive somewhere beyond those rolling hills. 40,000 North Vietnamese Army troops were positioning themselves for what would become one of the most intense sieges in American military history. Colonel David Lones, commander of the 26th Marine Regiment, stood in his command bunker reviewing intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. The signs had been building for weeks: increased enemy activity, rocket attacks, and an ominous discovery of NVA trenches creeping closer to the base perimeter. What the Marines didn't know was that General Vo Nguyen Giap, the mastermind behind the victory at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier, was orchestrating a massive deception. While American attention focused on Sanh, the real objective was drawing forces away from urban centers in preparation for the Tet Offensive. The base itself was a testament to American engineering and determination. Carved from the jungle-covered plateau near the demilitarized zone, Sanh sat astride Route 9, the only major east-west highway in the northern provinces of South Vietnam. Its strategic importance was undeniable. It blocked North Vietnamese infiltration routes and served as a launching point for operations into Laos. 6,000 Marines, along with South Vietnamese Rangers and Army Special Forces, called this remote outpost home. Sergeant Mike Thompson of Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, had been at Sanh for 3 months. He'd grown accustomed to the routine: patrol, guard duty, equipment maintenance, and the occasional mortar attack. But something felt different this morning. The usual sounds of the Vietnamese countryside, birds, insects, distant village activity had fallen silent. Even the Montana tribesmen who regularly visited the base had mysteriously disappeared. Thompson shared his unease with his squad, but like soldiers throughout history, they pushed aside their foreboding and focused on their duties. According to detailed accounts from Marine Corps historical records and survivor testimonies compiled in the Battle for Sanh by Moyer's Shore, the base had been under increasing pressure since late 1967. The first indication that something massive was brewing came from electronic intelligence. Radio intercepts suggested major troop movements, and aerial reconnaissance confirmed the construction of new roads and supply depots in the surrounding area. President Lyndon Johnson, haunted by comparisons to Dien Bien Phu, personally monitored the situation from the White House. He had a scale model of Sanh constructed in the Situation Room and demanded daily briefings on the base's status. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, Marines went about their routines with practiced efficiency. They cleaned weapons, reinforced bunkers, and prepared for another day in what many considered the most isolated and vulnerable position in all of South Vietnam. The irony wasn't lost on them while their countrymen back home debated the war's merits. These young men prepared to face an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 7 to 1. The base's isolation was both its strength and weakness. While the remote location made it difficult for the enemy to coordinate large-scale attacks, it also meant that resupply and reinforcement would be challenging once the siege began. The single airstrip, barely adequate for the massive cargo planes that kept the base supplied, would soon become the lifeline that determined whether Sanh would survive or become America's Dien Bien Phu. At exactly 0530 hours on January 21st, 1968, the earth around Sanh combat base erupted in a symphony of destruction that would echo for the next 7 to 7 days. The first salvo of rockets and mortars caught many Marines in their sleep, instantly transforming their sanctuary into a hellscape of twisted metal, burning fuel, and human screams. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, who had been on radio watch, felt the ground shake beneath his feet as the ammunition dump exploded in a fireball that illuminated the pre-dawn darkness like a miniature sun. The intensity of the bombardment was unlike anything the veterans had experienced. 130 rounds of rocket, mortar, and artillery fire rained down on the base in the first 90 minutes alone. The main ammunition supply point, containing nearly 1,500 tons of ordnance, detonated in a secondary explosion that sent shockwaves for miles. Sergeant Thompson, thrown from his bunk by the first impacts, crawled through smoke and debris to rally his squad as burning fuel and exploding ammunition created an apocalyptic scene. Colonel Lones, despite the chaos surrounding his command post, immediately grasped the significance of what was happening. This wasn't another harassing attack, it was the opening movement of a major siege. Radio reports flooded in from observation posts around the perimeter, all confirming massive enemy movement. The hill fights of the previous spring had been mere skirmishes compared to what was now unfolding. As communications with the outside world crackled with static and urgency, Loans realized that 6,000 American and South Vietnamese troops were now surrounded by an enemy force that intelligence estimates placed at 40,000 men. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Marines who had endured months of routine patrol and occasional contact suddenly found themselves in a fight for survival. The constant bombardment meant that movement above ground during daylight hours became a potentially fatal gamble. Within hours of the initial attack, the base began its transformation into a subterranean city as Marines dove into bunkers, trenches, and fighting holes that would become their homes for the next 2.5 months. Captain William Dabney, commanding officer of India Company, 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, stationed on Hill 881 South, watched through binoculars as enemy forces massed in the valleys below. His isolated position, 3 miles from the main base, offered a commanding view of the surrounding terrain, but also made his 185 Marines prime targets for enemy artillery. The hill positions 8-8-1- South, 861, and 558 formed a defensive triangle around Sanh, but they also divided the Marine force in complicated mutual support. Military historians, as documented in Sanh, Siege in the Clouds by Robert Pizer, note that the North Vietnamese strategy deliberately targeted these outlying positions to isolate and defeat them piecemeal. The first casualty reports began streaming into the command bunker as corpsmen moved through the chaos, treating wounded Marines under fire. The base medical facility, never designed to handle mass casualties, quickly became overwhelmed. Dr. Edward Feldman and his team of Navy corpsmen worked frantically to stabilize the wounded, while incoming rounds continued to shake the makeshift aid station. The sight of young Marines, many barely 19 years old, carried in on stretchers with grievous wounds, drove home the reality that this battle would exact a terrible price. Communication with higher headquarters became sporadic as antenna arrays were destroyed and radio equipment damaged. Colonel Loans found himself fighting not just the enemy, but also the perception, fostered by media comparisons to Dien Bien Phu, that Sanh was indefensible. General William Westmoreland, commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, publicly committed to holding the base at all costs. But the Marines on the ground knew that their survival depended more on their own skills and determination than on promises from Saigon. As the first day of the siege drew to a close, Marines counted their losses and prepared for what they now realized would be a prolonged ordeal. 18 Marines were dead, and 40 were wounded, a sobering reminder of their vulnerability. The ammunition dump continued to burn, sending periodic explosions through the night that illuminated the faces of young men who had aged years in a single day. They didn't know it yet, but they had just experienced the first day of what would become the longest siege in Marine Corps history. By the end of the first week of February 1968, Sanh Combat Base had transformed into a labyrinthine underground city where sunlight became a luxury and silence a forgotten memory. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, his face gaunt from lack of sleep and constant stress, had learned to navigate the maze of trenches and bunkers with his eyes closed. The relentless bombardment had driven the Marines underground, where they lived like moles, emerging only when absolutely necessary and always with the knowledge that death might be waiting above ground. The bunkers themselves were marvels of improvised engineering and desperate necessity, constructed from salvaged materials, steel planking, sandbags, timber, and anything else that could stop shrapnel. They provided minimal protection against the constant rain of enemy fire. Marines reinforced these shelters with layers of sandbags 6 feet thick, creating underground rooms that could house 8 to 12 men. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, unwashed bodies, and an acrid smell of explosives that seemed to permeate everything. Sergeant Thompson had established his squad's bunker near the base's northeastern perimeter, where they could observe enemy movement through crude periscopes fashioned from mirrors and metal tubing. Living conditions were primitive beyond description. Marines slept in shifts on cots made from ammunition boxes and canvas, ate cold sea rations because cooking fires drew enemy attention, and conducted personal hygiene with baby wipes and precious water rations. The psychological toll of this subterranean existence began to manifest in various ways. Some Marines became hypervigilant, jumping at every sound, while others retreated into themselves, staring blankly at bunker walls. The medical challenges were overwhelming. Navy Corpsman Richard Webster, attached to Bravo Company, treated everything from combat wounds to trench foot, pneumonia, and what would later be recognized as combat stress reactions. The base hospital, itself a reinforced bunker, operated under conditions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Surgery was performed by flashlight during bombardments, with doctors and corpsmen working while the earth shook around them. Wounded Marines often had to wait hours for evacuation flights that might or might not be able to land under fire. According to detailed accounts in Sanh, the final toll compiled by military journalist Michael Hare, the psychological impact of prolonged bombardment created a unique form of warfare that tested human endurance to its limits. Colonel Lones faced the enormous challenge of maintaining command and control over a dispersed force while under constant enemy fire. His command post, buried deep underground, became the nerve center of the defense. Maps covered every available surface, marked with enemy positions, friendly unit locations, and target coordinates for the massive fire support that kept the North Vietnamese from overrunning the base. Communication with subordinate units required runners who risked their lives crossing open ground between bunker complexes. The North Vietnamese strategy was methodical and relentless. Intelligence reports indicated they had positioned artillery pieces in caves along the ridgelines, making them nearly impossible to locate and destroy. Soviet-supplied rockets and mortars arrived in a steady stream along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, ensuring that the bombardment could be sustained indefinitely. Enemy sappers probed the perimeter nightly, testing defenses and gathering intelligence for what appeared to be an inevitable ground assault. Life underground created its own rhythm and culture. Marines developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between incoming and outgoing rounds, diving for cover at the first whistle of enemy shells while barely looking up when American artillery fired in support. Card games became currency for maintaining sanity, with poker tournaments conducted in bunkers while explosions shook dirt from the ceiling. Letters from home took on profound importance, connecting these underground warriors with a world that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. The isolation was psychological as well as physical. Radio broadcasts from Armed Forces Vietnam Network provided some connection to the outside world, but the news was often depressing anti-war protests at home, political debates about the war's conduct, and constant comparisons to Dien Bien Phu. Many Marines began to feel abandoned, fighting a battle that their own country seemed ambivalent about supporting. Yet this sense of abandonment also forged an unbreakable bond among the defenders, creating a brotherhood tempered in the crucible of shared hardship. Supply became a matter of life and death calculated in tons of cargo delivered under fire. Every landing was an adventure in controlled chaos, with transport aircraft racing against time and enemy gunners to deliver ammunition, food, medical supplies, and mail before taking off again. March 1st, 1968, marked the 40th day of the siege, and the character of the battle shifted dramatically as the North Vietnamese intensified their efforts to crack the Marine defenses through a combination of massive artillery barrages and coordinated ground attacks. Captain Dabney, still commanding India Company on Hill 881 South, watched through his field glasses as enemy troops moved openly in broad daylight, their confidence growing with each passing day. The psychological warfare was as relentless as the physical bombardment loudspeakers placed in the jungle broadcast propaganda messages in English, taunting the Marines about being abandoned and comparing their situation to the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The most terrifying addition to the enemy arsenal was the arrival of Soviet-made rockets that could deliver devastating payloads with frightening accuracy. The Marines had learned to distinguish between different types of incoming fire by sound alone: the distinctive whistle of mortars, the whoosh of rockets, and the sharp crack of recoilless rifle rounds. But these new weapons produced a sound that froze blood, a low, ominous rumble that gave little warning before impact. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, now a veteran of 6 weeks under fire, lost 3 members of his fire team to a single rocket that struck their bunker during what they thought was a routine lull in the bombardment. Underground, the conditions continued to deteriorate. The constant dampness of the monsoon season had turned many bunkers into muddy cesspools, where Marines lived in conditions that would have shocked Civil War soldiers. Trench foot became endemic, with corpsmen treating dozens of cases daily. Rats, drawn by food scraps and the smell of unwashed men, became unwelcome bunker mates. Some Marines, pushed beyond their psychological limits, began exhibiting symptoms of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder: 1,000-yard stares, uncontrollable trembling, and an inability to function during bombardments. The North Vietnamese had also begun extensive tunneling operations, honeycombing the hills around Sanh with a network of tunnels and bunkers that rivaled anything the Marines had constructed. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy sappers were digging approach trenches that extended to within 50 yards of the Marine perimeter. The psychological impact of this underground war was profound. Marines never knew when the ground beneath their feet might erupt with enemy soldiers. Listening posts reported the sound of digging at night, creating a paranoia that every footstep might trigger a catastrophic cave-in or explosion. Military analysts, as documented in classified after-action reports later declassified and published in The Siege of Sanh by John Prados, noted that the North Vietnamese engineering efforts represented one of the most sophisticated siege operations in modern warfare. Sergeant Thompson, now acting squad leader after his sergeant was evacuated with severe wounds, organized his men into a tight defensive unit that had learned to function as a single organism. They moved through their sector of trenches with practiced efficiency, checking fields of fire, adjusting range cards, and maintaining weapons that had to function perfectly despite the constant exposure to mud, moisture, and enemy fire. The Marines had discovered that their M16 rifles, designed for conventional warfare, often malfunctioned in the harsh conditions of prolonged siege warfare. The air war above Sanh had intensified into the largest sustained bombing campaign in military history up to that point. Operation Niagara, directed by General Westmoreland personally, coordinated B-52 Stratofortress bombers, tactical fighters, and helicopter gunships in round-the-clock attacks on suspected enemy positions. The psychological effect on both sides was enormous. Marines cheered when they heard the distinctive sound of approaching B-52s, knowing that somewhere in the jungle, North Vietnamese troops were experiencing their own version of hell. Medical evacuation had become increasingly dangerous and sporadic. Helicopter pilots who attempted to land at Sanh faced a gauntlet of enemy fire that claimed several aircraft daily. Dr. Feldman and his medical team had to make agonizing decisions about which wounded Marines could wait and which required immediate evacuation. The walking wounded often remained in the bunkers, treated with field dressings and pain medication while continuing to man their positions. The concept of a secure rear area had ceased to exist. Everyone at Sanh was a frontline combatant. The defenders had also learned to use the enemy's predictable bombardment schedule to their advantage. North Vietnamese artillery typically opened fire at dawn and dusk, with intermittent shelling throughout the day. Marines planned their movements and activities around these patterns, rushing to complete essential tasks during brief lulls and diving for cover when the telltale signs of incoming fire appeared. This deadly routine had become so normal that Marines joked about setting their watches by enemy artillery. Communication with the outside world remained sporadic and often frustrating. News reports that filtered through painted the siege as either a glorious last stand or a futile waste of American lives, depending on the political perspective of the reporter. March 6, 1968, began like any other day in the 7th week of the siege, but as darkness fell, it became clear that the North Vietnamese had chosen this night for their most determined assault on the Marine positions. Intelligence reports had warned of increased enemy activity, but nothing could have prepared the defenders for the coordinated attack that would test their resolve like never before. At exactly 2300 hours, the entire perimeter of Sanh combat base erupted in a firestorm of enemy fire that dwarfed even the opening bombardment of January 21st. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, now wearing the chevrons of a corporal after battlefield promotions, had decimated the NCO ranks, crouched in his fighting position. As enemy rockets began impacting with mechanical precision along the northern perimeter, the attack was different this time, more coordinated, more intense, and clearly designed to breach the Marine defenses rather than simply harass them. Through the smoke and explosions, he could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions that seemed impossibly close to the perimeter wire. The North Vietnamese had used their tunnel systems to move assault troops to within yards of the Marine lines. Captain Dabney's position on Hill 881 South came under simultaneous attack from 3 directions, with enemy troops emerging from concealed positions that intelligence had failed to detect. His company, reduced to 123 effective Marines after weeks of casualties and evacuations, found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy force that appeared to number in the hundreds. The hill's strategic importance made it a critical objective for the North Vietnamese, who understood that its capture would allow them to dominate the main base with direct fire weapons. Sergeant Thompson, now commanding what remained of 2 squads after casualties had forced consolidation, moved through his section of trench issuing orders and encouragement to Marines who had been pushed to their psychological and physical limits. Many of these young men had been in continuous combat for 4 to 4 days, living underground, eating cold rations, and facing the constant possibility of violent death. Yet when the moment came to fight for their lives, they responded with the professionalism and courage that had sustained the Marine Corps. Through 2 centuries of warfare, the battle raged with an intensity that surprised even veteran NCOs who had fought in World War II and Korea. Enemy sappers, carrying explosive charges and assault rifles, penetrated the outer wire in several locations and engaged Marine defenders in hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was so close that Marines couldn't use supporting arms without risking friendly casualties. In some sections of the perimeter, the battle devolved into primitive combat with knives, bayonets, and entrenching tools as desperate men fought for survival in conditions of near-total chaos. According to eyewitness accounts compiled in Sanh, 77 days under fire by Ray Stubb, a Navy chaplain who served throughout the siege. This night represented the closest the North Vietnamese came to achieving a breakthrough that could have led to the base's fall. The medical aid station became a scene of controlled chaos as wounded Marines were carried in faster than the limited medical staff could treat them. Navy Corpsman Richard Webster, working by flashlight as explosions shook the underground facility, performed triage decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Young Marines with wounds that would have been career-ending in peacetime begged to return to their units rather than be evacuated, understanding that their buddies needed every rifle to survive the night. Colonel Lones, monitoring the battle from his command post, made the critical decision to call in danger close artillery support. Despite the risk to his own troops, the base's defensive fires plan, rehearsed hundreds of times during the siege, went into full effect as Marine artillery, Navy guns from ships off the coast, and Air Force fighters converged on suspected enemy positions. The coordination required to deliver this massive firepower without hitting friendly forces represented one of the finest examples of combined arms warfare in military history. The psychological dimension of the battle was as important as the physical. North Vietnamese loudspeakers continued broadcasting propaganda throughout the assault, attempting to demoralize the defenders with claims that the base was surrounded and that no relief was coming. Some enemy troops shouted taunts in broken English, trying to provoke Marines into exposing themselves to sniper fire. But the Marine defenders had developed their own psychological warfare, responding with curses, battle cries, and the defiant humor that has always characterized American fighting men under extreme stress. As dawn approached on March 7th, the intensity of the assault began to diminish, but sporadic fighting continued throughout the morning. When the sun finally burned through the smoke and haze, the Marines could see the cost of the night's fighting scattered across the battlefield. Enemy bodies lay tangled in the concertina wire, testament to the ferocity of their assault and the effectiveness of the Marine defense. But the price had been high for both sides. Casualty reports would show this as one of the bloodiest single actions of the entire siege. The successful defense of the perimeter on this longest night marked a turning point in the siege, though the Marines didn't realize it at the time. March 15th, 1968, marked the 54th day of the siege, and both sides showed signs of reaching their operational limits. The sustained combat had pushed men and machines beyond normal endurance, creating a battlefield environment where survival often depended as much on luck as on skill. Corporal Rodriguez, his face hollow-eyed and aged beyond his 20 years, led a patrol through the maze of trenches that connected the base's defensive positions. The landscape around Sanh had been transformed into something resembling the moonscape crater, barren and littered with the debris of war. The psychological toll on the defenders had become increasingly evident to the medical staff and unit leaders. Marines who had shown remarkable courage and resilience during the early weeks of the siege now exhibited signs of combat fatigue that threatened their effectiveness. Some had developed nervous tics, others couldn't sleep despite overwhelming exhaustion, and a few had to be restrained during bombardments to prevent them from running blindly into enemy fire. Navy psychiatrist Lieutenant Commander Donald McLean, working from a reinforced bunker that served as both aid station and counseling center, treated dozens of cases of what was then called combat neurosis. Captain Dabney's position on Hill 881 South had become increasingly precarious. As North Vietnamese forces tightened their grip on the surrounding terrain, his Marines, now numbering fewer than 100 effective troops, controlled a perimeter that grew smaller with each enemy probe. Supply drops had become increasingly dangerous, with enemy gunners targeting the landing zones with deadly accuracy. On several occasions, Marines had to fight their way to supply bundles that landed in contested areas. engaging enemy troops in fierce firefights for crates of ammunition and medical supplies. The North Vietnamese strategy had evolved throughout the siege, adapting to Marine defensive tactics and the devastating effectiveness of American air power. Enemy forces had constructed an elaborate network of tunnels and bunkers that allowed them to move troops and supplies while avoiding aerial detection. Intelligence reports suggested that some of these tunnel complexes extended for miles underground, connecting supply depots, command posts, and fighting positions in a subterranean network that rivaled anything constructed during the previous World War. According to declassified intelligence assessments cited in the Secret War at Sanh by military historian Keith Nolan, North Vietnamese engineers had created one of the most sophisticated siege works in modern military history, demonstrating a level of tactical innovation that surprised American commanders. Sergeant Thompson, now wearing lieutenant's bars after his battlefield commission, had learned to function on 2 hours of sleep per night, while maintaining the combat effectiveness of his depleted platoon. The promotion system at Sanh had been compressed by casualties into something resembling a combat meritocracy. Marines who showed leadership ability and tactical competence found themselves wearing rank that would normally require years to achieve. The traditional military hierarchy had adapted to the realities of siege warfare, where a lance corporal who could keep his squad alive at fighting was more valuable than a staff officer without combat experience. The arrival of March brought unseasonably heavy rains that turned the base into a muddy quagmire and complicated both defensive operations and enemy attacks. The monsoon conditions affected everything from weapons maintenance to food preparation, adding another layer of misery to an already unbearable situation. Marines discovered that their individual fighting holes had become small ponds, forcing them to bail water constantly while maintaining vigilance for enemy probes. The moisture also affected ammunition, electronics, and medical supplies, creating additional challenges for the supply system. Medical evacuation had become the most dangerous mission anyone could undertake at Sanh. Helicopter pilots who attempted to land at the base faced a coordinated defense of anti-aircraft weapons, small arms fire, and mortars that had been precisely registered on all possible landing zones. Several aircraft were shot down, adding their crews to the casualty list and further complicating the evacuation of wounded Marines. Dr. Feldman and his medical team had to make increasingly difficult decisions about which patient absolutely required evacuation and which could be treated with the limited resources available. At the base, the air campaign supporting Sanh had reached unprecedented levels of intensity, with American aircraft flying thousands of sorties in support of the besieged Marines. B-52 bombers conducted round-the-clock missions, dropping millions of pounds of explosives on suspected enemy positions. Fighter bombers provided close air support during daylight hours, while AC-47 gunships patrolled the perimeter at night, their miniguns creating deadly curtains of fire that discouraged enemy movement. The psychological impact of this aerial armada was enormous on both sides. Marines drew comfort from the constant presence of friendly aircraft, while North Vietnamese troops lived in constant fear of detection and destruction from above. Communication intercepts revealed growing dissension within North Vietnamese ranks as the siege dragged on without achieving its primary objectives. Enemy commanders had apparently expected the Marine garrison to collapse under the psychological pressure of prolonged bombardment and isolation. April 1st, 1968, dawned with an unusual silence that made every Marine at Sanh combat base instinctively suspicious. After 71 days of constant bombardment, the absence of incoming fire felt more ominous than reassuring. Corporal Rodriguez, now acting as a squad leader despite his young age, cautiously raised his head above the sandbag parapet of his fighting position and scanned the surrounding hills through binoculars. The landscape that had been transformed into a hellscape of craters, twisted metal, and destroyed vegetation showed no signs of enemy movement for the first time since January 21st. The breakthrough had actually begun 5 days earlier with the launch of Operation Niagara Falls, a massive coordinated assault designed to break the siege from the outside. The 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile and elements of the South Vietnamese 1st Airborne Battalion had fought their way along Route 9, clearing North Vietnamese positions and reopening the land route to Sanh. The sounds of battle had been audible to the Marines in their bunkers. The distant rumble of tank engines, the crack of rifle fire, and the whoosh of helicopter rotors that signaled approaching relief. Lieutenant Thompson, his battlefield commission now confirmed by higher headquarters, organized his platoon for the first daylight patrol beyond the perimeter wire in over 2 months. The psychological impact of walking above ground in broad daylight, without incoming fire, was profound. Marines moved hesitantly at first, unable to believe that the constant threat of death from above had finally lifted. The abandoned North Vietnamese positions they discovered revealed the sophistication and determination of their enemy. Elaborate tunnel systems, carefully concealed artillery positions, and supply dumps that indicated the siege had been planned and sustained on a massive scale. Captain Dabney's company on Hill 881 South was among the first to be relieved, with fresh Marines from the relieving force taking over positions that had been continuously manned for 7 to 7 days. The contrast between the hollow-eyed, bearded veterans of the siege and the clean-shaven replacements was stark. Many of the newcomers stared in amazement at the conditions their fellow Marines had endured: the primitive bunkers, the maze of trenches, and the cratered landscape that resembled photographs from World War I's Western Front. The final casualty count revealed the true cost of the siege: over 300 Americans killed and thousands wounded, with North Vietnamese losses estimated in the tens of thousands. But the numbers, stark as they were, couldn't capture the psychological transformation that had occurred among the survivors. These Marines had endured one of the longest and most intense sieges in American military history, forging bonds of brotherhood that would last the rest of their lives. They had also gained something rarer and more valuable: the absolute knowledge that they could endure anything and emerge intact. According to the official Marine Corps history case Sanh, The Final Reckoning, published by the History and Museums Division, the siege represented both a tactical victory for American forces and a strategic success for North Vietnamese planners who had achieved their goal of diverting attention from the Tet Offensive. The evacuation of Khe Sanh Combat Base began almost immediately after the siege was lifted, reflecting a strategic decision that shocked many of the Marines who had fought so hard to defend it. Military planners had concluded that the base's strategic value didn't justify the enormous cost of maintaining it against future enemy action. The irony wasn't lost on the veterans. They had successfully defended a position that their own government now considered untenable. The abandonment of Khe Sanh would remain a source of controversy for decades, with many veterans feeling that their sacrifice had been rendered meaningless by political decisions. Navy Corpsman Richard Webster, who had treated hundreds of wounded Marines during the siege, supervised the medical evacuation of the last casualties as the base was systematically destroyed to prevent its use by enemy forces. The sight of Marines demolishing the bunkers and trenches they had lived in for over 2 months was emotionally wrenching. These crude shelters had been home fortress and sanctuary during the darkest period of their lives. Watching them disappear under explosive charges felt like losing a part of themselves. The psychological aftermath of the siege would manifest itself in different ways among the survivors. Some Marines adapted quickly to life away from constant danger, grateful to sleep through the night without incoming fire. Others found themselves unable to adjust to the relative safety of rare areas, suffering from what would later be recognized as survivor guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder. The brotherhood forged in the bunkers of Khe Sanh would provide crucial support networks for veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life. The strategic implications of the siege extended far beyond the tactical level. North Vietnamese planners had successfully used Khe Sanh as a diversion, drawing American attention and resources away from urban centers just before the Tet Offensive. While the Marines had won the tactical battle, the enemy had achieved their strategic objectives. This reality would influence American military thinking for decades, demonstrating that tactical victories didn't automatically translate into strategic success. As the last helicopter lifted off from Khe Sanh Combat Base on April 5, 1968, it carried with it the survivors of one of the most remarkable defensive actions in military history. These Marines had proven that American fighting men, properly led and supported, could withstand anything an enemy could deliver. The 7 to 7 days of Khe Sanh had tested the limits of human endurance and emerged victorious, creating a legacy that would inspire future generations of Marines. Facing their own moments of supreme trial, the empty base, soon to be overgrown by jungle vegetation, stood as a monument to courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged in combat. The Battle of Khe Sanh was over, but its legacy would endure as long as Marines remembered the meaning of Semper Fidelis, always faithful to each other, to their mission, and to the cause that had made them brothers in the crucible of war.